Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're touching on a question that I've had for probably like the last week or so. I did way too much research on it for my own curiosity, and then I was like, you know what? It could just be a perfect video. The question is, what is more important to an NHL front office? Is it the eye test, or is it this new wave that we're seeing in the NHL since like 2014 of data analytics, etc.? You know, from like distance covered, rebounds generated, and shot heat maps. So it's this question of what do GMs and NHL front offices, which is mostly the GM, what do they fall back on more? What do they care about more? Is it the eye test, trusting themselves, trusting their scouts, or is it the data models and the statistics of each player, or how they want to play? So for example, I'll put up on the NHL a few years back released NHL Edge, which is like the newest, most data-centric NHL stats, where you see shot maps here. Like you'll see the highest paid player, Mac and Celebrini's shot map here, and you can see like what zone time he is. So just a shot like that. That's what the NHL Edge does. This is public for us fans, public to teams obviously, but teams do have their own data departments. We see that with Carolina under the Eric Tulsky reign. Teams also have their own data like companies built into them, the way that John Chaika and his wife's company is now being used, not only by other teams, but is also being used heavily via the Toronto Maple Leafs, since he's now the new GM. But before we start, it's important to say, I obviously know, going into the research, that both the eye test and both data are crucial. But it's just whether or not, what percentage ratio are we looking at, 50-50? In most cases, probably. But is there a side that's better to be on? Is it 60-40, the eye test side versus data side? Like, what is the more important ratio to have in a GM? And what do most GMs / front offices around the league do? However, front offices in the NHL can favor one side, as we know. I just have some notes here to keep us on track. The latest stuff, the Eric Tulsky just won the Stanley Cup, is very stat heavy. So, for example, we're looking at a ratio of him maybe 95 to 5 on the eye test, because he's 95. He doesn't come from a hockey background. He comes from a data background, Harvard, Masters, and even in his inner circle, he hires guys like engineers. Like, he doesn't hire out and out NHL front office workers or hockey players. So I would give him a ratio of 95 to 5. John Chaika has some hockey in him. He played in the OHL as a forward for a little bit, so still very data forward. Like similar to Dubas in Pittsburgh, they're probably both around 80 to 20 data to the eye test. But there are front offices that are old-fashioned, and they rely more on their own hockey sense, their hockey IQ, and the eye test, and their scouts, right? So to rattle off a few names, we have Lou Lamoriello, Ron Hextall, the Jets' current GM, Kevin Cheveldayoff, if I'm not pronouncing that right, I know that. And then obviously, shocker, Bruins GM Don Sweeney, not surprised at all. He's the worst. John Tortorella is also, he's a coach, but he uses the perspective, that's a different weird perspective that we'll get into, that he uses the eye test more than data. And then 3-time GM Year the award winner, Jim Neal of the Dallas Stars, who arguably has one of the best scouting networks in the NHL, maybe Detroit too, but they don't make the playoffs, also relies more on the eye test than data analytics. But again, all these GMs do use a mix of both. And this video is a way to discuss the research that I did and to come to my own conclusion of what I think the perfect ratio is in this NHL, relying on more data or relying on the eye test. But I think it's important going into this what my definitions are. So my definition of the eye test is a way of judging a player's skill, impact, or value by watching them play live, viewing scouting reports, and look at their physical appearance / compete levels, and their character, as well as off-puck movement and hockey IQ. And I deem a 60-40 to be the lowest ratio to be favoring the eye test side. So that would be like the lowest I would go for there. On the other side, my definition of the database approach is a management style that uses advanced statistics, tracking data, and objective research to guide decisions on player acquisitions, contract valuations, and team strategy. They use models to create tactics on how to play. They use stats like expected goals and Corsi. Corsi, for if you don't know, it's kind of a newer stat that people are starting to care about, and that is an advanced statistic that measures puck possession by calculating the difference between a team's total shot attempts and their opponent's shot attempts. And again, same thing with the eye test. The lowest possible ratio for that is 60-40. And now that that's squared away, I think it's the best to start with the traditional side of it, so the eye test, because that's what obviously came first. So through the eye test, these veterans, GM, front offices, and coaches trust their abilities to find players and know their worth. So one of the names that I mentioned was Lou Lamoriello. He's a gold medal winner. He's a cup winner. He's been around the league for so many years. Just as a GM alone, it was 1987 to 2025 when he was thankfully finally let go from the Islanders. Still works in their front house. That's a topic for another time. Anyway, he watches games live. He trusts his gut, and if you're an Islander fan, you'll know this. He cares the most about character, and he cares the most about off the ice, right? That's why he never had guys. They always had to be clean shaven, had to dress a certain way. They had to arrive on time. That's why Barzell sleeps late, alarm clock, gets benched. So he cares a lot about that, and that's why the Islanders never made any moves, because he felt comfortable with their character, their team chemistry. That's why if the Islanders did make a move, Kyle Palmieri, Travis Zajac, guys, he knows their character. And it was the same thing with the Leafs and Devils. A Leaf to the Islanders, Pierre Engvall, that contract's horrible. But this is what he has to say on the data approach. Because when this came from an interview he did while with the Islanders, so this is like 2023, he said, unflappable and athleticism are second to none. Meaning, this was about Matt Martin as well. So this was when Matt Martin came back to the Islanders from the Leafs. Again, he was a GM of the Leafs, came to the Islanders. He cares more about the compete level. So he's saying, Matt, right there, unflappable, Matt Martin's compete level is second to none. And his athleticism are second to none as well. That's the quote. Athleticism is very important to the eye test because you can see how good of a skater they are. Ryan Whitney says that Michkov of the Philadelphia Flyers, horrible skater. And he's still young, he still has a lot of time, but he regressed a year. Granted, he had a car accident, came in overweight, didn't have the best training camp, so happens. We'll look to this year. But bad skaters in the NHL do stick out like a sore thumb. In English, stick out like a sore thumb. Good skaters in the NHL, they're pretty to watch. They're better on the puck. It just looks more effortless. So it's the eye test there helps. Isles GM Lou Lamoriello also said on a Sirius XM radio in 2023, you have to be very careful on his point of view analytics. Sorry, you have to be very careful with it. It can get in the way. So again, he's doubling down on his side that the eye test is more important because he's saying, which is true, that analytics can be distracting. It can get in the way of everything. You can see a guy, anyone on Carolina, you're looking at Corsi, or you're looking at shot attempts on goal. Taylor Hall probably has 50 times more shots than the next guy in the NHL. But that's because his playing style under the Carolina Hurricanes, under Rod, under Tulsky, is to shoot the puck. So let's just say his contract was up. Lou Lamoriello is like, okay, we need a guy who shoots the puck a lot. He comes to the Islanders because he sees those stats. Doesn't shoot because it's a whole new team, whole new system, whole new line mates. So stats, like we said, we're trying to find the best ratio. So stats can be distracting. So it's a very good point on Lou Lamoriello, and we can see his thought process behind it all. So I'm giving Lou a 90, and because he's very old school, we're giving him a 90 to 10 favoring the eye test ratio. Now moving on to our next person. I thought this would be an interesting one, having a coach in perspective inside. So I have John Tortorella, 2-time Jack Adam winner, 1 Stanley Cup winner, did bring Vegas to the Stanley Cup this year, and we obviously, under Torts and all his interviews and everything Torts has to offer, we know he values work ethic and compete more than anything. You know, with his famous rope in preseason, that's what he looks for. He's an old school coach. It's said that he's a very tough coach, very honest players. We'll never know in the locker room, but we do know that Vegas, he did take a lighter approach, just kind of being the confidence guy in the room, trying to say to these guys, like, you're all good hockey players. Nevertheless, in 2022, he said, I think analytics, and I quote, are trash. So just getting into his perspective of, he clearly is not a fan, right? Calls them trash, calls them useless. However, moving into a few years back when he went to Philly, they have a data's department in Philadelphia, so he started to use them a little bit. He didn't use the nitty-gritty stuff, but he did start to use a lot of the NHL GMs, let's take a step back, use 10-game splits. So they'll go through 10 games, some use 5, but they'll go through 10 games and they'll look at the main data points like shots on goal, goals against, etc. And they'll be like, okay, what's one stat do we want to change, positive or negative? And let's try to work with that, whether that's coaching tactics, changing up the lines, etc. So a lot of these GMs and coaches go through 10-game meeting models, and they meet, and then yada, yada, yada. So in Philly, he wasn't using the nitty-gritty stuff, but he got introduced to this 10-game split model. So he does use his models. He said that he uses them for goals for and goals against, to both check the team as base of play and individual players like plus minuses, etc. So we're going to give Torts on that regard a 75-25 because he's very much old school, still very much work ethic and compete levels, but he is using, whether or not he'll get a job, that 10 model split with data. Now finally, to probably the strongest part of this side of the argument is Jim Nill of the Dallas Stars. We once said earlier he's a 3-time GM of the Year winner. He had this is probably the most important part of his background, via that he cares more about the eye test. He has a 10-year scouting career before he became a GM in Detroit, and he helped them win 4 cups from 1997 to 2008. He then left Detroit, joined Dallas, and then worked his way up to the GM spot. So he trusts his instincts a lot. In his reign with Dallas, he has Rube Hintz, Wyatt Johnson, Stan Coven, and even the Tyler Seguin trade years ago are all ways that his eye test, being in the front office, trusting his gut, all great plays, Heiskanen, the Jake Oettinger, the list goes on with guys that he's drafting. Even though they're first-round picks, he's chosen these guys over others, right? Wyatt Johnson didn't even play a year during COVID. People are like, okay, and he's unbelievable. Tyler Seguin trade again, young kid in Boston, didn't have a lot of points, comes to Dallas, unbelievable player. Moving into the next part of the argument, Jim Nill in a 2024 interview said that over the years he's created an internal analytics department for the Stars and uses a mesh of trusting his instincts and IQ with numbers, whether for free agents, play style, and so forth. So again, a little more than Tortorella, but again, we're seeing a Jim Nill, a classic GM with a 10-year impressive scouting career, trusts his instincts, uses the eye test, uses hockey IQ, uses knowledge of the game, the players he's drafted, his team's play style, and takes that and uses the analytics department sort of like an aid or a sword to fall back on to see whether he's correct or not. So I think Jim Nill is the perfect example of a modern GM, and I think that you can see why he's so successful under this model. Signs Jason Robertson for 1 more year. And this is not even talking about cap space, right? This is just talking about the eye test or data. But he's a true modern GM of this current NHL. Now, I also, because I was doing a lot of research, I did a lot of counter arguments for this, like a true out-and-out research paper. So some counters I found for this was the eye test alone is human bias, which we probably see the strongest case with Lou Lamoriello. It's a surface level picture. Again, is it a weak counter argument? 100%. This is the weakest counter argument I've found, but it can make sense. Like for a guy of I'm blanking on his name, but he played for Pittsburgh this year, had 25 goals, extended his career, and he then signed a 2-year deal, times $5 million, I think, with somebody. Forgetting his name, but he played for Pittsburgh this year, and you thought he'd be out of the league by now, but revives his career. But in his new team, I think it's the Bruins or Detroit. It might not be the same. Sometimes front offices get it wrong, and they get it wrong all the time, trusting in a player with the idea that can change a player's positively. So they sometimes think that, we can change them. Positive example, Washington Capitals, Pierre-Luc Dubois. Negative example, the Islanders and Duclair. And then also they made a whole movie about it. A great movie, Moneyball, Billy Beane. It's not the gist of the movie, but the whole point of Billy Beane when he gets these flashbacks is that the scouts got it wrong. He was supposed to be a number 1 overall top prospect, and he flunked out of the league. So obviously, right, that's a big counter. GMs, front offices, they get it wrong all the time. And then finally, in this modern era of the NHL, we do know that it's going towards a very data and numbers-based era, whether that's internal departments or hiring GMs with statistic companies like Chika. It's a new way for teams that have little market size, like the Hurricanes, to get an edge on the rest of the NHL. Moving on to the other side of the numbers, the data, the analytics side of the argument here. Take a little step back. Let's flash back to 2014. This is when guys like Eric Tolsky, Kyle Dubas, and in a few months, John Chayka will be hired as GMs in the NHL. And this is where the numbers, the analytics era truly begins. Let's go to the recent Stanley Cup winner, the scientist himself, Eric Tolsky, 2026 Stanley Cup winning GM, and he had a cap space of over $10 million. Again, we're not talking about cap space, but that is impressive for someone on this side of the argument because it's so data-driven. He has no hockey playing experience, but he does have a chem degree from Harvard and a PhD in chem from Berkeley. He's also a Molten patent holder and worked in Silicon Valley for 10 years. So the guy knows pressure. The guy knows hard work. The guy knows numbers. He started consulting with NHL teams in 2013, and then he officially joined the Hurricanes in 2014, working his way up from a consultant all the way to being named GM not too long ago in 2024. After he was an analyst, head of analytics, and then VP of strategy, assistant GM, and then finally, as I said, 2024 became the GM. In Carolina, he uses analytics to help refine scouting, evaluate player value, and on-ice tactics to see what players fit in this very unique Rod Brind'Amour system. So that's very important, being an analytical GM in a Rod the Bod player system. He hires, like I said earlier in the video, outside engineers and data analysts with no hockey backgrounds, to no surprise because that's himself. He also uses microstats such as shots per 60 minutes to help players mesh into this shot-heavy Hurricane system. In a 2025 interview, Tolsky said, "In chemistry, I got to think through how to make something work, and I got the reward of making it work. Here, I get the reward of winning, and that's even more fun to me." So that's a great quote to show Tolsky's perspective because, like we said from his background, a very analytical mind, he's very tuned in that way. And like he says here, he gets to see how things work and then can make them work. Here, he uses his data, he uses his knowledge to sort of, in a very layman's term way, to plug square holes with square pegs. So you can see his very analytical approach. Even that answer to me is, someone with that, who has that mad scientist look, which he has. He is now more than 10 years in the league, being in the front office, and I think it's safe to say that Tolsky is a hockey guy, right? So he does understand the game. He probably doesn't watch a lot of hockey, to be honest with you. I never really see him in the press box, but he does understand the game a lot more than he did. but he still relies on his analytical mind and his modules and his unique out-of-the-box thinking to help give Raleigh an edge, to be honest. So I'm going to stick with, like I said, and I know I said in the beginning 95.5, but because of his 10 years in being in the league and consulting with teams and starting in 2013, I'm going to give him a 90-10 approach because he does have to use the eye test to see what sort of players could fit under the Rod the Bot system, like shot-heavy guys like a great example, they probably use Logan Stankoven. They probably use a lot of data to make that trade when Rantanen failed. Because they did another coach, we'll do another coach who's very publicly very data heavy. His ex-players always say how data heavy he is and how tedious and how much planning he does going into games. Jared Bednar of the Colorado Avalanche thought this offseason he would be a free agent. He's not. He's still coaching the Colorado Avalanche. He's the only coach in hockey history to win a championship in the NHL, the AHL, and the ECHL. He also, in the ECHL, did it as a player and a coach. Pretty cool. And he uses a blend of his own instincts and analytics. Because he always jokes about Makar, how it was sort of his play style, if you've ever seen that interview. Bednar makes the world of numbers. This is coming from his players and data understandable to the players. And implements them into film sessions and preparation, giving the players a roadmap. So let's just say we're in the film room, we're watching it here. He might go through a few statistics and then plays a clip, or he might play a clip of just a team's general play style, and then goes through. Look, so you saw that clip. They're first in the league in shooting. This is their Corsi. This is their shots per game, etc. In a 2025 article. He says, I quote, I start with our team first, and then I use information to help explain to the players. Listen, it's not just the eye test. So, he is, the way that Jim Nill uses himself first and then uses data to back him up, Bednar does the opposite. He uses the numbers and then watches, preps for the game, watches film, makes notes, etc., and then backs the numbers up with what he's seen. So, two different approaches, two highly prestiged people in the NHL, so they both know what they're doing, just two very different opposite approaches to it. The Avs analytics team is also something that he sort of built, and they provide pre-scouting reports to the coaching staff, highlighting key trends, vulnerabilities, and potential strategies for each matchup. So very busy job over in the Mile High City. Bednar integrates analytics heavily into his pre-scouts. Quote, I can show them some video quickly in 5 minutes, but if I add the analytics to it, it explains this is how they play, and I show them the video, like this is what the numbers say, this is what they're really good at compared to everyone else in the league. This is what we have to be prepared for, and then we'll show them the video, paints a clear picture. So that's just him explaining to an article why he puts on a video, shows some stats, or shows some stats, puts on a video, because it just helps paint the most clear picture for his team that he feels makes them prepared. And he probably did it a lot from October to April, and then come playoffs, I don't know what happened. Zach Parise, ex-Colorado Avalanche player for the hottest minute, said about Bednar's approach, quote, it's almost like he gives you a map of how to win the game, end quote. Quote, that's how I would describe it. It's the other team's strengths and weaknesses and how you can try to exploit those different areas, quote. So like we saw with the other quote about the pre-scouts, they're finding vulnerabilities through the data, through statistics, to sort of plan how they're going to approach the game. If the team dumps in a lot of pucks, they can see that via data, via models, and they're going to change the way that they want to play in their playing style that day. So I'm going to give Bednar, I'm going to give him 80, I'm going to give him 75-25 feels good for Bednar, because I think he relies a lot more on his hockey IQ and his coaching ability and his game instincts than the numbers, but he clearly does rely heavily on the numbers. Moving into our last GM, John Chaika, who was formerly the youngest GM in hockey history with the Coyotes in 2016, after co-founding the prominent hockey analytics firm Stathletes, which him and his wife co-own. We're not going to get into him getting kicked out of the league. He wasn't kicked out of the league. Kind of just shunned from the league after a lot of stuff. Now he's back with Toronto. That's it. To give you just a background on Stathletes, because I had no idea. I knew he owned it, but I had no idea what they kind of did. Playoff probabilities, player values, like maybe they used it for that Darren Radish 8x8. He'll be 38 by the time that contract's done. NHL GM are going up in value, so they could have used it there. Slot carries, tracking how often a player successfully controls and carries the puck into a high-danger scoring area per 60 minutes. And then rush shot attempts, quantifying individual or team generation of shots off the rush during on-man or fast break transition sequences. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what Stathletes does. John Chaika, as a GM, uses microstats, like those mentioned, and uses a contract model to illustrate a curve of a player's contracts and their increasing age. So probably looking at some of this for some of the younger guys in the league, like maybe Pittsburgh under Kyle Dubas, we're using a graph module to see that Covenant contract, okay? He's really young, 8 more years at 3.2, they were looking at this graph. Whereas some guys, it might just be a nosedive into something else, like that Bobrovsky contract. They signed him, so it couldn't have been a nosedive, but it could have been slowly going down. So I don't know, but that's sort of what he looks at and he uses according to this. 16-year player Steve Sullivan, and assistant GM to Chaika when they were in Arizona. Steve Sullivan said in a 2017 article on ESPN, I'll put it up on screen, he had his laptop and he had all these numbers that explained what draft picks were worth, what would happen if you make a trade, and what you would need in return if we were trading a certain pick or a certain player. He was pretty vocal and confident in himself for someone we had just hired. I was still suspicious, but it takes very, very few conversations with him about hockey to realize he does have a very high knowledge of the game. And once you realize that, it just becomes two guys talking about the game. So Steve Sullivan, prestigious in his own, with his own accolades, not coming from a data background, unsure of John Chaika when he first came into front house of Coyotes. Clearly, his mind was changed quickly. Whether or not that's just a PR statement, but it generally seems from his response there that it is genuine, and he does believe that Chaika knows what he's talking about. Whether or not his models were right at the time of 2017, they're definitely better now in 2026, 2027. Chaika has also said when he sat in a press box that he scrambles lines and adds notes to research later on. So it's kind of both right there, scrambling lines. That's the player in him. That's the hockey IQ in him. And then the research notes could just be data to look at later down the line to then maybe back up his line scrambling. And he takes a very finance-oriented approach. So basically a lot of numbers and a lot of information to help him make decisions. Chaika, a quote from a few years back in ESPN, applying analytics to sports is no longer in its infancy. He said this in 2017 in that same Steve Sullivan article. We're now pretty far down the road in terms of what you can do to apply numbers to decision making. And anytime you need to make a decision, the more information you can get, the better. You want to understand things at a deeper level. So there we go again. We see his mindset. He's using numbers first. He's using numbers second, and he's using the number third time. He's using number the third time to then confirm his decisions and opinions. So Chaika, he was, like I said, he was a very high scoring winger in the OHL back in the day, but he had a career-ending back injury. So he knows the game a little bit, and because of that, but because he's very data eccentric, we're going to use 85-15 ratio-wise for Chaika. And then the counter here for this side, cold numbers can sometimes be distracting, as we saw from Blue Amarillo's quote, or they do have a false front. Example, a player's numbers can be based on a bad system they play in. We saw this with Trevor Zegras under the Craig Cronin era over there in Anaheim. Second, it doesn't show intangibles. Again, stuff like the old traditional quote GMs and front offices look for: locker room chemistry, character, compete levels, leadership, and off-puck movement. Are they skating hard back to the bench? Stuff like that. Are they, just tying up guys' sticks in front? Little things that hockey IQ gets you that data doesn't. Data doesn't see that just yet. Maybe it doesn't. It doesn't. But in the future, it might. Data. There's some players can have small sample sizes. You have a guy that's been in the league for, let's just say, 18 games, and he had 7 points because of all the adrenaline and everything. So they might trade. A GM with data might trade for him, like Rucker McGordy, right? Like, he hasn't really come into the league yet, but very small sample sizes in other leagues. So we're just small sample size. Is the argument on that one. And then the last sort of is kind of the most hockey-oriented counter argument I'd say is hockey's a very random game. It's filled with weird bounces, so you can't really rely on numbers all the time, giving you all the facts. So that's why we're seeing a lot of GMs we see, like I went through, was Bednar was 75-25, Chaika 85-15. So they're using numbers. They're using numbers to confirm their theories, but then they're also kind of using their instincts too. We know that stats do help create play styles, like Billy Bean. Just what does he do? He gets on base, right? And I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Carolina Hurricanes, we saw it clearly worked this year. As mentioned, most active GMs today use a ratio of the eye test and data, whether it's using data as a secondary filter or while letting their eyes drive test final decision, or vice versa. Nonetheless, every GM has their own ratio, every front office has their own ratio, every coach has their own ratio. And before I give you what I believe to be the correct ratio, I do believe the NHL and data and analytics will only continue to increase and will only become a larger talking point in the game. Tolsky quote said, "It's a very secretive business, which makes total sense as each team are trying to get an edge over the other." And it is, end quote, and it is truly an arms race in the NHL, and it will only continue to be an arms race in the NHL, I believe. I think it will keep getting to that point, especially as the cap rises and teams need to worry about their cap space. However, after spending so much time reading articles, reading quotes, watching interviews, watching other people's opinions, etc., and having my own bias, I believe the correct ratio for the NHL front office is to be 65-35%, 65 eye test, 35% numbers and data. Hockey's a fast-paced game. It's filled with a lot of intangibles that matter a lot more than people think. How they fit into a team, compete levels, and I think one of the most important things and most interesting things that people don't think about is off-puck movement. Like I said, tying up sticks. Are they skating back to the bench hard? Little things like that. Are they getting under people's skin like a rat? Like, I think that's very important that data doesn't account for, and numbers can't really support or negate those things. So I do think that if I were to say the perfect ratio, it is 65% eye test and then 35% data and numbers, analytics backing up what you see. I think Jim Neal has it perfect. See what you see, using your IQ, using your instinct, and then if you use numbers to back that up and everything like that. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you agree or disagree with what my thoughts were, my opinions. Let me know what you think the perfect ratio is, and then let me know what would be your ratio. Like, for me, I think I fit into that 65-35, but maybe you're a Tolsky, maybe you're a 90-10. So let me know down below those two things, your ratio or what you would think the perfect ratio is. And I'll catch you guys next time.